Just after midnight, March 28, 1942, the mouth of the Loire estuary on the German-occupied coast of France. A worn-out destroyer, 24 years old, flying the German naval ensign, threads a channel her own escorting officers privately doubted she could cross at all, scraping her keel across a sandbar not once but twice before pulling free each time. She is not carrying torpedoes worth mentioning, and her guns are barely enough to defend herself against the coastal batteries already tracking her from the darkness on either bank. Hidden inside her bow, behind concrete and steel plating, are 4.5 tons of high explosive on a delayed fuse, and her entire purpose is to ram herself at full speed into the gates of the largest dry dock in the world. Within the hour, she will do exactly that. 12 hours after that, when curious German officers have gathered aboard the wreck to inspect her, she will explode, killing around 250 of them and destroying the one facility on the entire Atlantic coast of France capable of repairing Germany's last great battleship. By early 1942, with the battleship Bismarck sunk the previous May, the battleship Tirpitz had become the single greatest naval threat Britain faced, and the danger was not simply that she might sortie into the Atlantic to attack convoys. It was that if she did, and if the Royal Navy or the Fleet Air Arm managed to damage her, there was exactly one dry dock on the French Atlantic coast large enough to take her for repairs, the Normandy dock at Saint-Nazaire, built in 1932 to service the ocean liner SS Normandy, and at over 300 meters long and 50 meters wide, the largest dry dock on Earth.
Destroy that dock, and Tirpitz would have no safe harbor to run to if she was ever hit while operating against Atlantic convoys. Any serious damage sustained in the open ocean would force her back through heavily patrolled waters all the way to Germany, or leave her stranded and vulnerable to further attack far from any yard capable of repairing her. The dock could not be reached by conventional bombing, protected as it was by heavy anti-aircraft defenses, and surrounded by a working port town that was also home to a vast, still expanding U-boat pen complex, guarded by some 6,000 German troops and defended by concrete roofs up to several meters thick. It could only be destroyed from the inside. The plan that emerged from combined operations under Lord Louis Mountbatten struck even its own planners as barely workable. The dock gates sat behind shallow water and sandbars at the mouth of the Loire that no landing craft of the day could reliably cross, and the initial assessment was blunt. Without a destroyer capable of crossing that shallow approach and ramming the gates directly, the entire raid was pointless, summarized internally as no destroyer, no operation. The destroyer selected, HMS Campbelltown, was itself considered close to worthless as a fighting ship. Originally, the American destroyer USS Buchanan, laid down in 1918, she was one of 50 aging four-funnel destroyers handed over to Britain in 1940 under the Destroyers for Bases Agreement, ships so outdated that most were used for convoy escort or scrapped for parts rather than frontline combat.
To get her across the shoals at all, engineers stripped her down, removing armor, equipment, and 2 of her 4 funnels, cutting her draft to the bare minimum a heavily laden warship could manage, and disguised the remaining silhouette to resemble a German torpedo boat. Behind that disguise, engineers packed Campbelltown's bow with 24 Mark 7 depth charges, 4.5 tons of Amatol explosive in total, sealed inside a specially built steel and concrete tank just behind her forward gun mount. Charges fitted with time delay pencil fuses set for roughly 8 hours and linked together with detonating cord, set and cemented into place before the ship ever left port so that no one, friend or enemy, could disarm or alter the timing when she sailed. Around her, a flotilla of 18 small craft, an armed motor gunboat serving as headquarters ship, motor launches carrying commandos, and a motor torpedo boat as backup would land Lieutenant Colonel Charles Newman's commandos directly onto the dockside to finish by hand whatever the ramming and the delayed charge did not: the pumping machinery, the winding gear, the caisson mechanisms, anything that kept the dock itself functional even if the main gate somehow survived. Under Commander Robert Ryder's overall command, the force crossed the Channel on March 26th and 27th, timed to coincide with a diversionary RAF bombing raid intended to draw German attention skyward while the ships approached from the sea.
The diversion backfired in a way that nearly doomed the whole operation before it began. Ordered to bomb only identified military targets and to avoid French civilian casualties, the RAF bombers circled the port for nearly an hour, dropping single bombs at a time rather than making straightforward runs, an odd pattern that alerted the German flak commander, Captain Konrad Mecke, to the possibility of an imminent airborne assault and put every gun in the harbor on alert well before the ships ever appeared. The flotilla pressed on regardless, flying the German ensign and using a coded challenge response captured from a German trawler during the Vauxhall raid the previous December to buy a few more minutes as they closed the coast. At 0:30 on the 28th, Campbelltown crossed the sandbar at the river mouth, her captain, Lieutenant Commander Stephen Beatty, feeling her scrape bottom twice before she came free each time. At 0:28, with the flotilla a mile from the dock, Beatty ordered the German flag struck and the white ensign raised, and every German gun in the harbor opened fire within moments. 6 minutes later, at roughly 20 knots, Campbelltown drove her reinforced bow directly into the southern caisson of the Normandy dock and embedded herself there. Newman's commandos went ashore into a firestorm of searchlights and machine gun fire to demolish everything they could reach by hand, while the more lightly built motor launches, exposed and largely unarmored, took catastrophic losses from the German defenses ringing the harbor.
A separate motor torpedo boat fired a pair of delayed action torpedoes at the old entrance lock gate as a backup measure in case Campbelltown failed to reach her target. They lodged in the mud beneath the gate and did not go off until 2 days later on March 30th, killing 16 French civilians who had gathered to look at the damage. A grim reminder that a raid built around delayed fuses could not fully control when or on whom those fuses would finally go off. If you're finding this look at the raids the Royal Navy pulled off against impossible odds worthwhile, subscribing is a quick way to make sure you catch the next one. Of the 611 sailors and commandos who took part, 168 were killed, and roughly 200 more were captured, meaning barely a third of the raiding force made it back to Britain. Most of the small motor launches meant to carry the men home were destroyed in the harbor before they could withdraw. Lieutenant Colonel Newman, having led his men ashore and overseen the demolition parties, found himself and the survivors of his command cut off from any surviving boat and was taken prisoner along with them, spending the rest of the war in German captivity before his Victoria Cross was gazetted. But the charge inside Campbelltown's bow, cemented in place days earlier, did not go off on the schedule the Germans expected. It detonated at noon, nearly 12 hours after the ramming, by which point German officers and curious onlookers had gathered on and around the wreck to inspect the ship that had rammed their prize Dryawk. The explosion killed around 250 of them and tore out the caisson entirely, putting the Normandy dock out of action for the rest of the war, and by some accounts, not fully returned to service until 1947 or 1948.
The raid produced 89 separate decorations in total, including 4 Distinguished Service Orders, 17 Distinguished Service Crosses, and 11 Military Crosses, alongside 5 Victoria Crosses awarded to Beatty, Ryder, and Newman, and posthumously to able seaman William Savage and Sergeant Thomas Durant. More Victoria Crosses than any other single operation of the Second World War. Tirpitz never received the damage that would have sent her looking for the dock Campbelltown destroyed, but the strategic effect held regardless. For the rest of her career, she was, in effect, trapped. Denied any Atlantic repair facility large enough to take her, she operated only from Norwegian fjords, useful to German planners chiefly as a threat that had to be watched rather than a battleship that could be risked far from home, and increasingly a drain on resources the Kriegsmarine needed elsewhere, rather than the offensive weapon it had been designed to be. That same caged battleship would be crippled at her Norwegian anchorage over a year later by a raid of an entirely different character, midget submarines slipping past her nets to lay explosives directly beneath her hull, and finally sunk at anchor by RAF bombers in November 1944, never having fought a British warship in the open Atlantic her designers had built her for. The Normandy dock itself, known today as the Louis Joubert Lock, still stands at Saint-Nazaire, its gate rebuilt long ago, a permanent marker of a ship that was never meant to survive the mission in the first place. None of what happened at Saint-Nazaire that night was decided by anything written on a specification sheet. On paper, HMS Campbelltown was a 24-year-old destroyer of a design so obsolete that most of her sister ships had already been broken up for scrap or reduced to secondary duties. Sent against the largest, most heavily defended dry dock gate in the world with barely enough armament to survive the approach. What the specifications could not capture was a crew willing to run a stripped-down warship across a sandbar their own planners doubted she could cross, engineers who could hide 4.5 tons of explosive well enough to survive a full day of German inspection, and commandos willing to go ashore under searchlights to finish the job by hand if the ship herself somehow failed. The Normandy dock had been built to service the largest ocean liner and later the largest battleships in the world. It was not built to survive an obsolete destroyer that had already been written off and a crew who treated that write-off as the perfect disguise.